They told me to dress nicely for my brother's big day. The Hales are a refined family, Mom said, so I showed up in silence, watched the bride mock me, and waited. 3 hours later, as her father gave his toast about legacy and love, the screen behind him showed their fraud charges instead. I'm Harper Lane, and this is how I turned their wedding into my courtroom. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, don't forget to hit subscribe, smash like button, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. The moment I stepped into the ballroom, the air shifted. The chandeliers above sparkled like falling stars, their light dripping onto crystal glasses and polished marble. A quartet played something delicate in the corner, violins weaving through the hum of conversation. The scent of lilies and champagne floated thick in the air, sweet, heavy, expensive. For a second, I just stood there in the doorway, my heels clicking against the marble I once scrubbed on my hands and knees. I smoothed my black dress simple and clean. I had chosen it because it was quiet, the kind of elegance that didn't beg to be noticed. That used to be me, trying not to be seen, not tonight. Then I heard her, so the filthy cleaning girl finally managed to show up. The bride whispered loud enough for everyone within 10 feet to hear. Her tone was honeyed cruel. Victoria Hale, perfect teeth, perfect hair, perfect poison. Her bridesmaid snickered eyes flicking toward me like I was a smudge on the glass. I caught the reflection of my brother Evan standing beside her. He laughed. That small, careless sound went straight through me. He didn't look at me, not even once. I felt the smile pull at my lips anyway, practiced and polite, the kind that hides blood behind lipstick. Funny thing about people like her. They never look down long enough to see who they're standing on. I walked forward, each step deliberate. The marble glimmered under my feet, the same marble I'd cleaned with bleach 10 years ago. I remembered the sting in my nose, the ache in my knees. Tonight, I wasn't bending for anyone. My voice inside my head was calm, steady. They didn't know that every inch of this place, every chandelier above their heads, every paycheck behind that bar, belonged to me. Guests drifted around in soft laughter and perfume. I smiled when I had to, nodding as though I were one of them. I wasn't. None of them knew the woman in the black dress signing every paycheck in the room. That was the fun part. Power is quieter when no one suspects you have it. Across the room, I spotted my mother, Diane Lane, 63 pearls around her neck, pride around her shoulders. She was laughing with the bride's parents, Robert and Linda Hale, like she'd known them forever. When her eyes met mine, her smile faltered just a little. She waved politely, then turned to call Evan over instead. My brother, her golden child. He came obedient as always. The three of them laughed at something I couldn't hear, something I didn't need to. I made my way to the bar. The bartender caught my eye, recognition flickering for a split second before he masked it with professionalism. "Evening, Ms. Lane," he murmured softly, as he handed me a glass of Merlot. I nodded once. "Thank you, Tom." His posture straightened a little. He knew. The staff always knew. I had asked them not to say a word, not to greet me formally, not to slip up and ruin the illusion. Let them think I was a guest. Let them think I was nothing. The music swelled again. I turned slightly, watching Victoria glide across the floor in her silk gown, hand looped through Evan's arm. Cameras flashed. She leaned up to kiss his cheek, smiling at the photographers. She was glowing, and I wondered how much of that glow came from the champagne, or the lie she was living. Probably both. Behind them, the massive gold letters on the stage glowed bright Hale Lane Wedding. The letters shimmered like they owned the air. My name was up there, but it wasn't mine. It belonged to someone who thought he'd earned everything handed to him. My brother looked happy. I wanted to hate him for it. Instead, I felt something smaller, sadder. A kind of grief that didn't have a funeral. "Can I get you another?" Tom asked quietly. "No, thank you," I said, and took a slow sip. The wine was rich, full-bodied, a little bitter. I liked that. It matched the night. A man nearby made a toast, clinking his glass. Laughter broke out. My mother's voice rose above the others, warm and social. "We are so proud of Evan," she said. "He's marrying into such a refined family. Refined." The word dug its way under my skin. I almost laughed. My mother had spent her whole life chasing refinement like it was salvation. She'd never realized what it cost. I drifted toward the back of the room, letting my eyes move over every detail. The linen tablecloths, the crystal centerpieces, the servers balancing trays of shrimp cocktails. I knew what each of those cost down to the dollar. I had approved every invoice. I'd even negotiated a discount with the florist myself. If only they knew. One of the bridesmaids passed by, glancing at me up and down. Her smile was syrupy. "You look nice," she said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a performance. I smiled back steady, just enough teeth to make her uncomfortable. "You too. Must be exhausting, keeping all that perfection in place." She blinked, confused, then scurried off. Small victories. Near the stage, Victoria's parents stood like royalty receiving subjects. Robert Hale's handshake was firm, politician smooth. Linda Hale sparkled with diamonds heavy enough to buy a house. My mother laughed at something Linda said, tipping her head back a little too far. I knew that laugh. It was the sound of someone pretending to belong. For a moment, I wondered if any of them, my mother, my brother, his perfect fiancé, ever thought about the girl they left behind, the one who couldn't afford college, who worked night shifts, and sent money home anyway. The one they never visited. Maybe they didn't remember. Maybe they chose not to. I set my glass down and walked toward the balcony. Outside, the ocean spread black and endless under the moonlight. The night air was cool against my skin. From here, I could see the glowing reflection of the hotel in the glass windows. Hundreds of people celebrating inside, unaware that their perfect evening was built on the back of a woman they thought they'd buried in the past. My voice in my head softened. I didn't come here to cause a scene. But tonight, they started a show I'm going to finish. I turned back towards the ballroom, the sound of laughter echoing behind me like an old song I no longer wanted to dance to. I was 19 when I left Seaview, Maine with $300 and a duffel bag that smelled like salt water and detergent. My mother didn't even come to the bus station. My dad handed me a thermos of coffee and said, "Call when you get there," but we both knew I wouldn't. The ride to Boston took 6 hours. I spent most of it staring out the window at the blur of pine trees, wondering if running away from disappointment was the same as chasing something better. The city smelled different, like exhaust and ambition. I found a room above a laundromat that cost $60 a week, shared with a stranger who snored through every night. The wallpaper peeled, and the heat barely worked, but it was mine. I got a job 2 blocks away, at the old Harbor Inn, cleaning rooms on the night shift. 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week, $10 an hour before taxes. The first week nearly broke me. The smell of bleach clung to my hands no matter how many times I washed them. My back ached, my feet burned, but I kept going. When you clean up after other people, you start to see what they hide. Dirt doesn't lie. People do. Every night I'd push my cart down the carpeted hallways, listening to muffled music and laughter spilling from behind closed doors. I remember one suite where 2 men bragged loudly about a $50 million deal. I paused, holding a bag of dirty towels, listening. They laughed like gods. I didn't understand half of what they said, but I liked the sound of it. That was the night I decided hotels were more than jobs. They were stories stacked floor by floor. I started learning the rhythm of the place. When the lobby was quiet, I'd linger near the front desk, watching how guests were checked in, how credit cards were swiped, how smiles were timed just right. The assistant manager, Marcus Reed, noticed. He was in his early 30s, sharp but kind with that calm tone people listen to. "You're the new night cleaner," he said one morning when I was emptying the trash near the desk. "Yes, sir." He smiled. "You don't need to call me, sir. I work here too." He pointed at the front desk computer. "You want to learn how to check a guest in." That was the beginning. When things were slow, Marcus showed me how to open reservations, print receipts, even handle complaints. He explained that good service wasn't about being perfect. It was about being aware. People don't remember rooms, he said once. They remember how you made them feel walking in. I started staying late to help him organize paperwork. I took night classes at community college, basic accounting and hospitality management. I'd sleep maybe 3 hours a day between shifts and homework. The other housekeepers joked that I was trying to clean my way into management. Maybe I was. There were nights when I almost gave up. One winter storm knocked the power out, and I spent 6 hours mopping up a flooded hallway while guests complained about the cold. My hands cracked from bleach. I cried in the supply closet, the kind of crying you do when you can't tell if you're tired or hopeless. But the next night I was back with my mop scrubbing like the floor owed me something. 6 months in, everything came crashing down. A guest staying in room 208 called the front desk at midnight, furious about a missing towel. I knew I'd stocked that room myself. Marcus was off that night. The night supervisor was new. When I tried to explain, the guest snapped, "I'm paying $300 a night, and you people can't count to 4. He demanded someone be fired. The supervisor didn't even look at me before saying, "Harper, hand over your badge." I remember standing outside in the cold with my time card still in my pocket. Snowflakes melted on my cheeks. Or maybe they were tears. It was hard to tell. I'd never felt smaller. I sat on the curb, my backpack beside me, trying to figure out if pride could keep you warm. A car pulled up. Marcus stepped out, his coat half-buttoned, coffee in hand. "You planning on freezing to death out here?" he said. I didn't answer. He sat down next to me, the kind of gesture that made the rest of the world feel less cruel. "They fired me," I muttered, over a towel. He looked at me for a moment, then shook his head. "You don't belong with a mop. You belong in management." I laughed bitterly. "I don't belong anywhere." He stood brushing snow from his coat. "Then make a place. I need an assistant, someone who knows the floors better than the suits upstairs. You in?" I stared up at him, unsure if it was pity or belief I heard in his voice. "You're serious?" "As a payroll audit," he said. "Start tomorrow, and bring that stubbornness you keep trying to hide. You'll need it." That job changed everything. Working under Marcus, I learned the language of the business. The timing, the numbers, the politics. I saw how guests treated staff, how staff treated one another, how everything depended on small, invisible details. I learned that leadership wasn't about standing above people. It was about standing beside them when things got ugly. Sometimes late at night after closing reports, I'd walk down the hall with my old mop, cleaning a patch of floor no one would notice. It reminded me where I came from, the sound of the handle against tile, grounding me more than any paycheck. Marcus once caught me doing it and said, "Old habits die hard, huh?" I smiled. "Some habits keep you honest." He nodded thoughtfully. "Humility looks good on you, Harper. Don't lose it." He was wrong about one thing. I belonged to both, the mop and the office. The mop taught me what management forgets: humility, patience, and the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience. By the time the sun rose over the city, the lobby lights flickered back on, and I could smell coffee brewing somewhere in the distance. I looked out the front window at the streets waking up and thought, this is where it starts. I didn't know it then, but the next 10 years would build everything I was standing on now. Every chandelier, every marble floor, every ounce of quiet power that no one at that wedding would ever see coming. By the time I pulled into my parents' driveway in Seaview, 4 years had already passed. The house looked smaller than I remembered. White paint chipped near the porch rail, one shutter hanging crooked. The same wind chimes still clanged by the door, only softer, older. I sat in the car for a minute, engine idling, trying to remember why I'd agreed to come back. Mom's 60th birthday. That was the excuse. But truthfully, I think I just wanted to see if anything had changed. Inside, the kitchen smelled like roast chicken and lemon cleaner. The lights were warm, the kind that make everything look cozy, until you start to notice the cracks. Mom was standing by the stove wearing an apron that said, "Bless this mess." She didn't turn when she heard me. "You want it," she said, like it was an inconvenience. "Hi, Mom." I set the flowers I'd brought on the counter. "Happy birthday." She glanced at them. "They're pretty. You shouldn't have spent your money." I smiled tightly. They were on sale. Her face softened only a little. "Evan's on his way. He's bringing that new girl he's dating. She's in marketing too, just like him. They're such a power couple." She said power couple like it tasted sweet on her tongue. I sat at the table listening to her go on about Evan's promotion, how he'd just landed a new client, how proud she was that he was finally moving up. "Our boy's a marketing genius," she said with a laugh. I kept my eyes on the table. "That's great, Mom." She turned to me, her smile faltering. "And what about you, honey? Still working at that motel?" I could have corrected her, told her it was a hotel, that I was in management now that I was studying for my business certification. But the words stuck somewhere behind my teeth. I just nodded. "Yeah, still working." She sighed in that way only mothers can. Like disappointment was a familiar melody. "You know, Harper? I just worry about you. You're so smart, but you keep yourself small." Dad, sitting quietly at the end of the table, cleared his throat. "She's doing fine, Diane." She waved him off. "Of course she is. I just mean, Evan's making a name for himself, and you're comfortable, I suppose. Nothing wrong with that." Her voice was sugar, but her eyes were knives. I took a slow sip of water, pretending it didn't hurt. Comfortable's underrated. The clock ticked loud in the silence that followed. Dad's fork scraped his plate. He gave me a small, guilty glance, the kind that said he saw everything but wouldn't say a word. Silence runs deep in our family, especially when it's supposed to protect the favorite child. Dinner dragged on. Mom talked about neighbors I didn't know about a local girl who'd just married into a rich family. She's moving to Connecticut. Her husband works in finance. Some people are just born lucky, she said, letting the words hang in the air between us. I looked down at my hands, calloused nails short and uneven. Lucky wasn't what built those hands. Work did. She must have noticed me zoning out because she reached for my plate. You didn't eat much. I'm not that hungry, I said. Still watching your weight, she asked, not unkindly, but sharp enough to draw blood. Still working nights, I answered. You eat differently when you live by coffee and vending machines. She tisked, shaking her head. You should have stayed in school. You'd have a better life. There it was, the verdict she'd been saving. I stood up to help her clear the table, but she brushed past me to get the dishes herself. I caught my father watching his mouth twitching like he wanted to say something. He didn't. As I wiped the counter, my eyes landed on the empty chair by the window, the one my grandmother used to sit in. The cushion was still indented where she used to rest her elbows while knitting. Suddenly, I was 12 again, sitting beside her on the porch near the sea. The waves were calm that day, the air filled with salt and her perfume, lavender and something warm like sugar cookies. She was holding a small velvet box. This was your great-grandmother's, she said, opening it. Inside was a sapphire pendant on a silver chain, the stone catching light like a drop of ocean. Clean hands build strong walls. Harper, keep yours clean no matter what dirt they throw. I remember asking her what she meant. She smiled. It's not about soap, sweetheart. It's about the choices you make. You can't control the mess around you, but you can decide not to roll in it. She passed away the following spring. After that, dinners like this got quieter, meaner. The warmth left with her. Mom's voice brought me back. Could you take the trash out before you leave? Sure. I grabbed the bag, tying it tight. The air outside was cold, the kind that stung your lungs when you breathed too deep. I tossed the trash into the bin and stood there a moment staring at the lights flickering through the kitchen window. Mom and Dad were laughing now. Evan must have arrived. I watched his car pull in, a sleek black Audi. Figures. I went back inside. Evan was hugging Mom, holding a bottle of wine. Hey, sis, he said, giving me a quick pat on the shoulder like I was a coworker he barely knew. Still living in the city. Yeah, I said, still working at that motel. He laughed, not cruelly, just carelessly. Good for you. Stick with what you know. Right? Mom swatted his arm. Be nice. She's trying her best. I smiled, but inside something solid and old shifted. I wasn't angry anymore. Just done. After dessert, I helped Mom load the dishwasher while Evan and Dad talked sports in the living room. The laughter from the TV mixed with the sound of running water. For a second, I felt invisible, like a ghost that still remembered being alive. When everyone went to bed, I packed my bag quietly. My room hadn't changed. Same pink curtains, same posters curling at the edges. Childhood memories felt smaller than I remembered. I took one last look around, folded a note, and left it on the kitchen table. I'm not coming back until I have something to be proud of. The rain started just as I backed out of the driveway. The windshield wipers groaned, struggling against the downpour. The house disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by darkness and wet pavement. For the first time that night, I felt something close to peace. The kind that comes when you finally stop trying to be loved by people who don't know how. By 2015, Boston no longer felt like a city I was trying to survive in. It felt like a place I could build something. The old Harbor Inn had changed ownership, and Marcus had moved on to manage Harbor Suites Boston, a mid-range hotel in the financial district. He called me one afternoon and said, "You ready to move up Lane? I've got a supervisor position with your name on it. I didn't even ask what it paid. I just packed my uniform and showed up. Being floor supervisor was the first time I had my own set of keys. It was also the first time people rolled their eyes when I gave an order. Management wasn't glamorous. It was sleepless, thankless, and one bad review away from disaster. But I loved it. I learned to handle overbooking, staff fights, power outages, everything that could go wrong between check-in and check-out. By 2016, I was promoted to front office manager. My name was on the door now. Small letters, but still there. I trained new hires, managed budgets, and even handled renovations during the off-season. I learned to negotiate, to read contracts, to look someone in the eye, and not blink first. In early 2017, a real estate agent I'd met through a supplier mentioned a small boutique hotel on Beacon Hill that was going under. 12 rooms, 1 lobby, and an owner desperate to sell. It's a dump, he told me. But the location's gold if you can flip it. Everyone said it was a bad investment. They were right, until I turned it around. I took out a $200,000 small business loan, signed every line with a shaking hand and a steady heart. The day I got the keys, I walked through every room, peeling wallpaper, busted pipes, broken furniture. The place smelled like mildew and old regrets. I rolled up my sleeves and got to work. I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. I slept in the manager's office on a folding cot, painted walls myself, fixed faucets with YouTube tutorials, even sewed curtains to save money. The local hardware store started greeting me by name. Some nights when the city went quiet, I'd sit in the empty lobby and imagine it full. Travelers, laughing glasses, clinking life humming through the halls. Marcus showed up on a Sunday morning with coffee and said, "You look like hell. Need a general manager." "You serious?" I asked, barely looking up from a paint tray. "Serious enough to work for someone half my age," he said. "Let's make this place shine." We worked side by side for months, him handling vendors and payroll while I ran operations. When the first guest checked in, an old couple from Vermont, I stood behind the desk pretending to type just to hide how much I was shaking. The hotel opened officially in November. By Christmas, we were fully booked. By spring, travel blogs were calling it Boston's hidden gem. A year later, I'd paid off the loan and doubled the building's value. I renamed it the Silver Harbor Inn. The name came to me late one night while cleaning the lobby floor. The reflection of the chandelier on the marble looked like water, like home. Between 2018 and 2020, I opened 2 more small hotels, one in Newport, another in Portland, Maine. Investors started calling. I turned down most of them. I didn't want partners who'd never mopped a floor in their life telling me how to run my business. Instead, I built slow and steady. By 2020, Silver Harbor Hospitality Group was officially born. We had 5 properties along the East Coast and 3 more in development. Marcus became the group's operations director. Boss, he'd joke every time he came into my office. "You clean up nice." The truth was, I didn't clean up at all. I still wore the same black flats to every meeting and carried a small notebook instead of a tablet. When contractors tried to overcharge, I'd pull out itemized invoices and make them squirm. I once fired a plumber mid-job after catching him padding labor hours. "You're billing me for time I spent arguing with you," I told him. He sputtered something about misunderstanding. I didn't flinch. He left. The business grew faster than I ever planned. I started hiding behind layers of paperwork and companies. Silver Harbor Holdings, LLC became my shell, my anonymity. My name wasn't on the brochures, not on the press releases, not even on the tax documents that weren't legally required. People see what you want them to see, and sometimes invisibility is leverage. I started getting invited to hotel conferences, the kind with name tags and champagne breakfasts. I'd sit quietly listening to executives brag about occupancy rates and loyalty programs. When they asked where I worked, I'd smile and say, "Operations Small Chain." No one remembered me that way, and that was exactly how I liked it. In 2021, I expanded into Charleston and Providence. 8 hotels total, over 600 employees. I'd built something real, something no one in Seaview would believe if I told them. Then, in 2023, a journalist from Forbes reached out through my PR contact. They were doing a Women to Watch issue and wanted to feature the mystery owner behind Silver Harbor. I said no at first. Then Marcus convinced me, "You don't have to show your face, just your initials. People should know what you built." So the article ran HL, the visionary behind the East Coast's most quietly successful boutique brand. There was a photo of one of my lobbies, sun streaming through glass, captioned with words like resilience and vision. My name wasn't there, but my story was. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't need to. Sometimes late at night, I'd walk through one of the hotel's heels, echoing down the hallway staff saying, "Good evening, Miss Lane," not realizing who I really was. I'd check the linens, adjust a crooked picture frame, pick up a scrap of paper from the floor. Old habits. One night I sat in my office, the city lights stretching beyond the window. On the wall above my desk hung my grandmother's sapphire necklace framed in glass. I'd had it restored after finding it tangled in an old jewelry box. The stone caught the light just right, blue and calm. I leaned back in my chair, tired but content. I was still cleaning, just on a larger scale. Outside, the rain tapped softly against the glass. I thought about Seaview, about the people who never thought I'd leave that small town, and about the marble floor in Newport, where everything would come full circle one day. I didn't know when, but I could feel it coming. The moment when the girl with the mop would finally walk into her own reflection and not look away. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick and ivory, the kind of stationery that screams money. My assistant left it on my desk beside the morning reports, and at first I thought it was another investor proposal. Then I saw the gold embossing. Evan Lane and Victoria Hale. A celebration of love, my brother's wedding. My stomach turned the same way it used to when I smelled bleach. I traced the letters with my thumb, the way you do when something looks beautiful, but feels wrong. Inside was a smaller card, my mother's handwriting looping across the bottom. Please look presentable. The Hales are a refined family. I laughed, out loud, the kind of laugh that sounds more like a breath giving up halfway through. Some wounds never close. They just stop bleeding until someone twists the knife. Marcus walked in mid-laugh, holding a folder of quarterly reports. What's so funny? I slid the envelope across the desk. Guess who's getting married? He read the names and let out a low whistle. Your brother and the Hale girl I've heard of Hale Properties. Their books don't add up. I raised an eyebrow. You think they're shady? He leaned against the doorframe. Let's just say their assets are more smoke than steel. You sure you want to go to that wedding? I'm not sure I want to do anything I said. I picked up the invitation again. The cardstock was thick, expensive. My mother's note still stared up at me like an accusation. But I'm not missing it. Marcus crossed his arms. You sure that's about family or about revenge? I smiled faintly. Sometimes those are the same thing. That night, I walked along the harbor, wind biting through my coat. The water was dark, restless, slapping against the docks. My reflection wavered on the surface. Half of me solid, half of me ghost. Pride or closure, I thought. Which one would it be this time? The sky was bruised purple, city lights stretching across the waves like veins. I remembered walking these same docks years ago when I couldn't afford a cab home, when success was just a story I told myself to fall asleep. I'd come so far, I almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at me in the glassy water. And maybe that was the point. By the time I got home, I'd already made my decision. I was going. Later that evening, my phone rang. Mom flashed on the screen. I answered. Harper. She said without preamble. You got the invitation, I did. Her tone softened just slightly. Good. I wasn't sure you'd come. I wasn't sure either. There was a pause. Then the sigh I knew too well. Listen, don't make things awkward. Victoria's family is different. They're used to a certain kind of people. I let the silence stretch just long enough for her to hear it. Don't worry, Mom. I won't embarrass anyone. But I can't promise no one else will, she hesitated. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. I changed the subject. How's Dad? He's fine. Just, please, Harper, try to make an effort. It's your brother's big day. Her words hung there. Make an effort. Like she'd never stopped measuring me by effort instead of worth. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and opened my laptop. I booked the best suite at the Silver Harbor Hotel Newport. My hotel, my terms, under a fake name. I wanted to walk in like a stranger and leave like a storm. The week leading up to the wedding was chaos at work. Investors wanted updates on expansion plans, and the Charleston property had plumbing issues. But my mind kept drifting to that envelope, sitting on my desk to Victoria Hale's name in gold. I'd Googled her once. Beautiful, perfectly curated life, always photographed in some expensive dress next to her entrepreneur father. They looked like a family out of a magazine spread, which I suppose was the first red flag. On Friday evening, I drove to Newport. The closer I got, the more the memories hit. Long shifts, tired nights, the smell of ocean air mixed with cleaning products. The Silver Harbor Hotel rose ahead of me, its glass facade glowing against the darkening sky. I'd seen it 1,000 times before, but that night it felt different, like it was watching me back. At the front desk, the clerk greeted me with a smile. Welcome to Silver Harbor, Ms. Jensen, she said, reading the name I'd booked under. Her tone carried a flicker of recognition, like she almost knew me, but she didn't. That was the beauty of anonymity. My suite was on the top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows, white roses on the coffee table, and a view of the Atlantic that looked like it could swallow the world. I dropped my bag on the bed, toed off my shoes, and stood at the window for a long time. Down below, decorators were unloading boxes, floral arrangements, strings of lights. Tomorrow's spectacle was taking shape. After dinner, I took the elevator down to the ballroom. The doors were open, the scent of fresh paint and new polish heavy in the air. Workers were setting up gold chairs, adjusting table linens. A team of florists argued softly near the archway where vows would be exchanged. I stepped inside unnoticed. The room was a masterpiece of symmetry. White roses, crystal chandeliers, gold-trimmed everything. It was beautiful, but it wasn't warm. It was the kind of beauty that wanted to be admired, not lived in. I ran my hand along one of the marble columns near the entrance. The surface was cold, smooth, unyielding. I could still remember when my hands used to ache from scrubbing it clean from polishing it until my reflection shone back at me like a stranger. Still the same, I murmured. My voice echoed faintly in the empty room. Only difference. Now I signed the paychecks. A maintenance worker nearby looked up puzzled, but I smiled and waved him off. Just admiring the craftsmanship, I said. He nodded and went back to adjusting the lights. I stood there a moment longer, staring at the gleam of the chandeliers overhead. Tomorrow, this room would be filled with laughter music and lies. My brother's laugh would echo against the same marble I used to clean. My mother would beam like a queen. And somewhere in the crowd, Victoria Hale would be playing her perfect part, unaware that the stage she was standing on didn't belong to her. I slipped my hands into my coat pockets and turned to leave. The hotel was quiet, except for the low hum of the air conditioning and the distant crash of waves. As I walked toward the elevator, I caught my reflection in a gold-framed mirror. Poised, steady, unreadable. The girl who once mopped these floors was gone. But the woman who replaced her, she was just getting started. By morning, the hotel felt alive in a way that only happens on wedding days. The air was thick with perfume and nerves. Florists rushed through the corridors with buckets of roses. Waiters adjusted champagne flutes on silver trays, and the sound of a live band tuning their instruments bled faintly through the ballroom doors. Every corner buzzed with anticipation. Every surface gleamed. My staff had done well. I entered through the side entrance, past the service hallway where the smell of coffee and frosting mixed with fresh linens. No one looked twice at me. I was just another woman in heels walking like she belonged. Marcus was waiting near the kitchen doors, clipboard in hand, headset around his neck. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed. "You sure about this?" he said quietly. "Completely." He exhaled. "All right, but you know this family's trouble. I've seen their invoices, the way they talk to the staff. It's off." I adjusted my jacket, nodding once. "Just keep the team neutral. No special treatment for the Hales. Not even a free bottle of water without a receipt." His lips twitched something between a smile and a sigh. "Got it. Neutral. Good luck out there, boss." "Luck's for people who need it," I said. "I've got timing." I left the service hallway and stepped into the chaos of the main lobby. Guests in tuxedos and sequined dresses mingled beneath the massive crystal chandelier. Laughter echoed like a chorus of glass breaking. My mother stood near the entrance, glowing with pride. She wore a pale blue dress that shimmered when she moved her hair done perfectly, her posture regal. I froze when I heard her voice. "You look stunning, sweetheart," she said to Victoria, who was standing beside her in a white silk robe surrounded by bridesmaids. "You're the daughter I always dreamed of." The words hit me like a punch, sharp and quiet. My fingers curled around the strap of my purse. From where I stood, they looked perfect together, my mother and the woman who would become her favorite replacement for me. I wanted to feel anger, but all I felt was something smaller exhaustion. Victoria's laughter was light and practiced. "Oh, Mrs. Lane, you're too kind," Diane beamed. "Nonsense. You're a blessing to this family." I turned away before I said something I couldn't take back. The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Floral arches big enough to frame doorways, a champagne tower tall enough to climb a string quartet rehearsing near the stage. Every detail screamed wealth and status. My wealth, my hotel, my staff. Evan stood near the front, checking his cufflinks, laughing nervously with his groomsmen. He looked good, older, confident, in that easy way men get when life never makes them prove themselves. I felt a strange pang of affection for him. He had no idea what he was walking into. You have no idea what you've signed up for, I whispered under my breath. I started to walk toward him, but something stopped me. A man's voice, low and tense, carrying down the hallway behind the ballroom. Once the marriage certificate's signed, we're in the clear, the voice said. The investors will get off our backs. I froze. The sound came from the alcove near the side exit. I stepped closer, careful not to let my heels click too loudly on the marble. Robert Hale stood there, half hidden behind a floral arrangement phone pressed to his ear. His tone was clipped businesslike. No, I don't care about the press. After the wedding, it's all settled. We'll shift the accounts and disappear from the board for 6 months. By the time anyone asks questions, we'll be in another project. I told you. Trust me. He ended the call and adjusted his tie, scanning the hallway. I ducked behind a pillar until he passed his cologne, sharp and synthetic. My pulse was pounding. I knew that name. Robert Hale. 2 years earlier, I'd read an SEC memo about a real estate group under investigation for investor fraud. Same last name, same pattern. Fake development projects, offshore accounts, and sudden disappearances when the lawsuits hit. I had brushed it off at the time. Now it felt like that headline was whispering in my ear. I pulled out my phone thumb, trembling slightly as I typed. Run a check on Hale Properties Priority 1. I hit send to Rebecca Owens, my attorney, and the only person I trusted with my instincts. I stared at the message for a moment before locking the screen and taking a deep breath. The wedding buzzed on around me. Music starting, champagne corks popping, staff moving with military precision. I blended back into the crowd, the calmest person in the room. Victoria spotted me from across the ballroom and flashed a smile so perfect it could have been painted on. She glided over her dress, shimmering with tiny pearls. Harper, she said, stretching out my name like it was an afterthought. I'm so glad you could make it. You look simple, but in a classy way. I smiled back, meeting her eyes. That's what I was going for. Understated elegance. Her smile twitched, just barely. You must be so proud of your brother. I am, I said. He's marrying a woman who knows exactly what she wants. That's rare. I suppose it is. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. You know, Evan told me all about your little hotel business. How charming. Family support must mean the world to you. Always has. I said evenly, even when it wasn't there. Her eyes flickered, but she recovered fast. Well, she said, patting my arm, I hope you enjoy yourself. Just relax, and let the professionals handle everything. Oh, I plan to, I replied, watching her walk away. I trust the management here completely. My voice was steady, but inside I was already piecing things together. Robert's phone call, Marcus's warning, Rebecca's silence. As the ceremony rehearsal started, I sat in one of the back rows, blending in with the crowd of vendors and early guests. The chandeliers above shimmered with light so clear it looked almost unreal. The quartet played something soft and sweet, the kind of music meant to make people forget the world outside. My phone buzzed hours later, a single message lighting up the screen. It's worse than you think. I stared at it, the room around me blurring for a second. My reflection shimmered in the glass of a champagne tower, fragmented and sharp. They thought they owned the room. They didn't realize I owned the building. I slipped the phone back into my purse, lifted my gaze to the glittering chandeliers overhead, and let the truth settle in like a storm cloud waiting for lightning. Something was about to break, and when it did, I'd make sure it fell exactly where it needed to. The file came through just after sunset. Rebecca's message was short, the kind that made my stomach drop before I even opened the attachment. You were right, read this privately. I sat on the edge of the bed in my suite, the glow of the laptop lighting up the room. Line after line filled the screen. Financial records, court documents, deposit slips, fake company names. Hale Properties wasn't just shady. It was a house of cards. Investor fraud, offshore transfers, federal investigation pending, and there it was buried halfway through the report. Victoria Hale's real name, Sierra Walsh. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't a marriage. It was a business merger built on lies. The perfect family, the perfect bride, all fiction written to buy time. I scrolled further down. Arizona 2018. Mugshot sealed under alias protection. Charges dropped, records sealed, but not erased. She'd done this before. A knock came at the door. I closed the laptop, straightened my posture. Marcus stepped in, eyes drawn tight. Rebecca. Called me, he said. You saw it. I nodded. Every line. He rubbed the back of his neck. So what's the play? Call the cops now. Not yet. I stood, crossing to the window. The ballroom lights below shimmered like a galaxy. We do it my way, publicly, no backroom whisper, no confusion. Everyone sees who they are. Marcus stared at me. That's a hell of a show, Harper. Then let's make sure it has good lighting. He swallowed hard. What do you need? Set up a backup video feed in the ballroom, I said. I want the truth projected on every screen when I give the signal. Rebecca's okay with this. She trusts me. He nodded slowly, already taking out his phone. All right, I'll get the AV team. I'll tell them it's a slideshow update, and the timing. When Robert Hale starts his toast, he gave me a long look. You sure you want to burn it all down? I turned back toward the window, the reflection of the city glowing around me. I built everything I have from ashes. Fire doesn't scare me. He left without another word, and I was alone again with the silence pressing in from every side. Later that evening, I walked down the corridor toward the bridal suite. The sound of laughter leaked through the half-open door, Victoria's laughter high and rehearsed. Her bridesmaids giggled around her, their voices dripping with envy and adoration. I knocked lightly. Come in, she called, her tone all sweetness. The smell of perfume hit me first, jasmine, and something artificial like money trying too hard. Victoria sat in front of a mirror surrounded by white roses, her reflection glowing under the vanity lights. Her hair was pinned perfectly, her makeup flawless. For a moment, she looked like the woman every magazine said you should want to be. Until she opened her mouth. Well, she said, smirking at my reflection in the mirror, you clean up better than I expected. What is it? Borrowed dress. I met her eyes through the mirror, keeping my tone even. You're good at pretending, but some stains don't wash out. Her smile didn't falter, but her gaze sharpened. She dismissed her bridesmaids with a tilt of her head. Could you give us a minute? The girls scattered, whispering as they left. When the door clicked shut, she stood and crossed the room slowly, silk whispering against the carpet. I know about your little charity payments, she said softly. You send money home every month, to your parents. Does your family even thank you? Or do they just pity you? My hands stayed still at my sides. But something cold moved through me. She had done her homework. You should worry less about me, and more about who's watching you. Her expression didn't change, but her voice dropped an octave. If you try to ruin this, I'll drag your name through every gutter I can find. Don't forget, I know where you came from. I stepped closer. Close enough to see the pulse flutter at her neck. I've lived there before. You'll get lost before I do. The air between us went still. For the first time, her eyes flickered, the mask slipping just enough for me to see the fear underneath. A phone buzzed in my pocket. Marcus. I turned slightly, pulling it out without breaking eye contact. His message was simple. FBI verified your tip. They're ready when you are. I looked up, meeting Victoria's reflection again in the mirror. She'd gone back to pretending, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face, the picture of composure. But her hands were trembling just enough to betray her. Big day tomorrow, I said. You should rest. She forced a laugh. Don't worry about me, sweetheart. I sleep fine. I smiled. That makes one of us. As I left the room, I caught our reflections side by side in the mirror, her white dress glowing under the lights, me in black, our faces split by the glass. One honest one, built on fraud. Down the hall, I paused and whispered to myself, let's see who breaks first. Outside, the corridors hummed with soft music and staff chatter. I could hear the ballroom band rehearsing again, violins warming up for the big day. Somewhere beneath that sound, I could feel the storm tightening. I walked toward the elevator's heels, clicking against the marble, the weight of the night pressing on my shoulders like a secret ready to be set free. Tomorrow, the truth wouldn't just come out. It would be projected for everyone to see. And when it did, every chandelier in that ballroom would shine a little brighter, reflecting not their perfection, but my revenge. The ballroom shimmered under the soft gold light of the chandeliers, a glow so warm it could almost make you forget the chill that came with deception. Guests whispered and laughed as they found their seats. Tuxedos brushing against sequined dresses, champagne glasses clinking in anticipation. A violin quartet played something slow and elegant, the kind of melody that tried too hard to sound like love. I sat near the back hands folded neatly in my lap, eyes steady on the altar. Everyone loves a wedding, especially when they don't know it's about to turn into a crime scene. The room smelled of white roses and expensive perfume. My mother sat in the front row, clutching a lace handkerchief like a relic from a better world. Evan stood at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him. That polite, nervous smile I'd seen since childhood stretching across his face. He looked like a man who believed he was about to start his forever. Poor fool. The music shifted. The crowd turned as the doors opened. And there she was, Victoria Hale arm hooked through her father's. The train of her gown trailed behind her like a crown of lies, her smile so serene it was almost convincing. I watched the way she walked, measured deliberate, the gait of someone used to admiration. Robert Hale walked beside her looking every bit the proud father. The lights caught his watch gold and gleaming, probably worth more than one of my hotel suites. He smiled at the crowd like he owned them. Across the room, Marcus caught my gaze from the control booth near the AV station. He gave the faintest nod, invisible to anyone but me. Everything was ready. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke about love and faith, about the beauty of two souls becoming one. The irony nearly made me laugh. My mother dabbed at her eyes, whispering to a woman beside her. "I can't believe my son married into such a perfect family," I muttered softly. "Perfect's an expensive illusion." The vows were short. Victoria's voice trembled just enough to sound genuine. Evan's eyes never left her face. When the officiant finally declared them husband and wife, applause erupted. Guests rose, phones flashing, tears glistening. I clapped once out of habit more than sincerity. The newlyweds moved to the ballroom's grand stage, surrounded by friends and family. The MC, cheerful and oblivious, grabbed the microphone. And now a few words from the father of the bride, Mr. Robert Hale. Applause again. Robert stepped up, glass of champagne in hand, confidence oozing from every pore. He looked at his daughter, then at the crowd. "Thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate this beautiful union," he began, his voice smooth, practiced. When Victoria first introduced us to Evan, we knew immediately he was the kind of man who values family integrity and hard work. The same values we live by. I almost choked on my drink. Family, integrity, hard work. I'd met con artists before, but few were so proud of their fiction. Robert continued his speech, perfectly rehearsed. "This marriage isn't just about two people. It's about legacy. It's about love. It's about two families coming together to build something lasting." My mother nodded along like she was at a sermon. My father sat still, polite but unreadable. Evan smiled, drinking every word. Victoria clutched his arm and rested her head on his shoulder, the picture of a devoted bride. My phone buzzed in my lap. A message from Rebecca agents ready outside. "You give the word." I took a slow breath and typed back 2 words, "stand by." "Stand." Robert raised his glass voice, booming through the room. "To love, to family, to forever." Glasses lifted. Champagne sparkled. The orchestra swelled with triumphant music. I stood slowly, my chair scraping against the polished floor. Marcus saw me move. My thumb hovered over my phone screen for 1 second longer than it needed to. Then I sent the message, "Now." The lights dimmed slightly as the ballroom screens behind the stage flickered. At first, the guests thought it was part of the show, another slideshow of baby photos or romantic montages. But then the images changed. The happy couple's portraits vanished, replaced by something colder, sharper. Legal documents appeared. Court seals, wire transfer records, corporate filings. Then came the mugshot. A younger version of Victoria, different hair color, but the same eyes, the same sharp smile. The text beneath it read, "Sierra Walsh, alias Victoria Hale, fraud identity theft, 2010. Arizona, a murmur rippled through the room. Someone gasped. The violinists stopped mid-note. The air thickened. Robert blinked at the screen confusion, flickering into panic. "There must be some mistake," he stammered, gripping the microphone. This isn't, turn that off." The AV crew didn't move. Marcus stood calmly in the booth, arms crossed. More images appeared. Bank statements showing wire transfers to offshore accounts, investment contracts, signed by Robert and Victoria, under false names, headlines, from financial investigations. Each slide hit like a hammer. Guests whispered loud enough to be thunder. My mother's face went pale. My father reached for her hand. Evan looked around disoriented, then back at his new wife. "What? What is this? Victoria's expression faltered for the first time, the mask slipping. Her lips parted, but no sound came. I stepped into the aisle, the hum of my heartbeat louder than the music that had stopped. I walked forward, slow and steady, until I stood just behind the last row of guests. My voice carried through the microphone system, calm, deliberate. Before anyone celebrates forever, I said, maybe you should know who you're toasting. Every head turned toward me. The cameras did too. Victoria spun around, her face drained of color. You, she started, but the words caught in her throat. Robert tried again to shout over the chaos. Shut it off now. But it was too late. Pandemonium erupted. People stood from their chairs, phones filming, whispers escalating to shouts. Someone in the back yelled, "Is this real?" It was real. It was all but real. The news crew that had been hired to record the wedding kept filming, their red lights blinking like sirens. The orchestra quietly packed up their instruments, sensing disaster. The champagne tower teetered as someone brushed against it. Evan turned to Victoria, voice breaking. "What's going on, Vic?" "What are they talking about?" She didn't answer. Her eyes darted toward the exits. From the control booth, Marcus's voice came softly through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you'll remain calm, authorities will be here shortly." I exhaled once, slow, steady, the kind of breath that feels like freedom after years of holding it in. The truth was out. The lies were cracking open like glass underfoot. Somewhere in the distance I heard sirens. Victoria's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like she was gasping for air. For a second the room was silent except for the hum of the projector. Then her voice split the air. "You lying bitch." "None of that's true." I stepped forward, heels echoing across the marble, each sound sharp as a heartbeat. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. True enough for the FBI to be waiting outside. Every head turned toward me. Phones lifted. Cameras blinked red. The orchestra had stopped playing the silence so loud it made the chandeliers tremble. Evan's voice broke through, raw, confused. "Harper, what are you doing?" I looked at him, not with anger but pity. "Cleaning up." Robert Hale's composure cracked. "Cut the feed," he barked, turning toward the AV booth. Two of my security staff, already briefed by Marcus, stepped in front of the door. Their arms crossed, their expressions blank. Marcus's voice came through the microphone, calm and professional. "Sir, I'm afraid that won't be possible." Guests were whispering now, frantic and fascinated. "Is this real? What's happening? Oh my God. I think she's serious." Victoria's mask shattered completely. She pointed at me, her hand shaking. "She's jealous. She's just a cleaning girl who can't stand seeing her brother happy. She's always been pathetic." Her words hit the crowd like sparks on dry wood. Murmurs swelled, half shock, half hunger for scandal. I smiled faintly. "You're right," I said loud enough for the room to hear. "I used to be a cleaning girl. Now I own the hotel you're standing in, and the company you tried to con." Gasps rippled through the ballroom. Someone dropped a glass. The shatter echoed like punctuation. Robert froze mid-step. "You own this place, I do," I said. "Every chandelier above your head, every square inch of marble under your overpriced shoes. You didn't just walk into my hotel. You walked into your own reckoning. Diane." My mother had her hand over her mouth. My father looked at her like he couldn't believe it either. Evan was standing still, his face, pale eyes, darting between me and the screens behind the stage. He opened his mouth, but no words came. The sound of heavy doors swinging open cut through the noise. Heads turned. 3 figures entered the ballroom, 2 men in dark suits and a woman flashing a badge. The air went cold. The lead agent, a tall woman with calm eyes and a voice that carried authority, stepped forward. "Robert Hale, Linda Hale, Sierra Walsh. You are under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy." The room erupted in chaos. Guests gasped, chairs scraped, someone screamed. Victoria stumbled backward, clutching her skirt as the 2 agents closed in. Her mother, Linda, started sobbing. Robert's face turned a deep shade of red. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "You can't arrest us here. This is private property." The agent didn't blink. "You're right about one thing, sir. It's private property, and the owner invited us." All eyes swung back to me. Victoria made a sound halfway between a scream and a sob as the agents grabbed her by the arm. "This isn't happening. You can't do this to me." One of the agents recited her rights. The words bounced off the ballroom walls like an echo from a bad dream. Evan took a step toward her. "Victoria, What the hell is going on? She turned on him, desperation in her eyes. Evan, please, you have to believe me. She's lying. But even as she said it, her voice faltered. She knew the fight was over. Robert lunged toward the stage, but Marcus intercepted him. Sir, I wouldn't do that. Security moved in smooth and silent, guiding the crowd back. No one dared interfere. Phones recorded everything. Every flash, every tear, every inch of humiliation. The agents cuffed them one by one. Robert first, then Linda. Finally, Victoria. Sierra, her white silk gown brushing against the floor as she struggled. The sound of the metal closing around her wrists cut through the noise. I stood still watching. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Just finished. Victoria stumbled, nearly falling, and the hem of her gown dragged across the marble, picking up streaks of dirt and spilled champagne. Her makeup streaked down her cheeks, her eyes red and furious. She'd called me filthy, but in the end, her dress picked up more dirt than I ever did. As they led her past me, she twisted, her voice ragged. You'll regret this. Harper, you think you're better than me. You're nothing. I leaned in just close enough for only her to hear. Not as much as you will. The agents pulled her away, her cries fading as the doors slammed shut behind them. The noise of the crowd surged again, filling the space she'd left behind. My mother lowered her hand from her face, eyes glistening. She couldn't look at me. My father rubbed his temple, whispering something I couldn't catch. Evan just stood there, staring at the doors like he was waiting for them to open again, for someone to tell him it had all been a mistake. The chandeliers overhead still glowed, their light glinting off the champagne puddles and broken glass. For a moment, everything felt suspended, the calm after a storm that had just redrawn every line in my family's story. I turned toward the staff standing by the wall, their faces pale, unsure. Clean up the mess, I said quietly. We've still got guests to feed. Marcus met my eyes from across the room and gave a single nod. As I walked toward the exit, I caught my reflection in one of the ballroom mirrors. The black of my dress, the steady set of my shoulders, the faint smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like the girl who had something to prove. I felt like the woman who finally stopped apologizing for surviving. And somewhere behind me, on the marble, I used to scrub the footprints of a con artist, were already being mopped away. 3 days later, the hotel still hadn't gone quiet. Silver Harbor was trending everywhere. Twitter morning talk shows, even late-night comedy. Every anchor used the same line with the same mix of disbelief and delight. Bride arrested during wedding at Newport Luxury Hotel. I stood by my office window, the harbor stretching out below in soft gray light. The city hummed like it always did, oblivious to the chaos my name had stirred. My phone buzzed non-stop with reporters, legal updates, and congratulations from people I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored all of them. The only thing that mattered was the silence after the storm. Then the phone rang again, and I saw my mother's name. I hesitated before answering. Hi, Mom. Her voice trembled. Why didn't you tell us? Tell you what? That you're the owner of the hotel, the one all over the news. I kept my tone soft. You never asked. There was a pause, the sound of her breath catching. Harper, everyone's talking about you. They said you saved Evan. You exposed that woman. I did what I had to do. I said quietly, for the company, for the truth, for the family. She whispered. I didn't answer. We both knew that word had always meant different things to her and to me. That afternoon, Evan showed up unannounced. My assistant tried to stop him, but I waved her off. He looked older, thinner. The confident grin I'd seen at the wedding was gone, replaced by the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd had the ground ripped out from under him. He stood in the doorway for a moment before saying, You've got a hell of a view. I worked for it, I said, gesturing for him to sit. He didn't. I didn't know, he said, about her, about any of it. She fooled me, too. I folded my hands on the desk. You laughed at her joke, Evan. That's what I'll remember. He flinched, eyes darting toward the window. You're right, I did. And I'm sorry. Apologies are strange. They don't undo anything. But sometimes they sound like the first brick in rebuilding. I nodded slowly. I believe you. For what it's worth. He sat finally, his shoulders slumping. The FBI talked to me. Said they think she used me as part of her cover. I could have been charged if you hadn't found out first. You should have trusted your instincts, I said. He gave a small, broken laugh. Guess I trusted the wrong woman. I looked at him. Really looked at him, and for the first time since childhood, he seemed human to me, not golden, not favored, just a man who'd made a mistake and was trying to live with it. "I don't hate you," I said. "But I hope you learn from it." He nodded, stood, and paused at the door. "For what it's worth. I'm proud of you. Even if I never said it." "That's something I said." He left quietly, and the room felt heavier without him. A few hours later, there was another knock. I looked up, expecting my assistant again, but this time, it was both my parents. Diane clutched her purse like she was walking into a church. My father hovered behind her, his eyes uncertain but kind. "Come in," I said. They stepped inside, hesitant, as though the room itself might bite. My mother's voice was small. "This place is beautiful." "It's work," I said. She nodded, fidgeting with the strap of her purse. "We didn't realize how much of it was yours. The papers said you own 8 hotels. 8? I shrugged. "I lost count after 6. She gave a shaky laugh that turned into silence. My father cleared his throat. "You've done well, Harper." "Thanks, Dad." The quiet stretched again, long and uncomfortable. Finally, my mother said, "I wish you'd told us. We would've." "What?" I asked gently. "Believed in me sooner." Her lips pressed together. I opened my phone and swiped through the banking app. With a few taps, the screen filled with transaction records, 4 years of anonymous transfers, mortgage payments, utility bills, medical expenses. Everyone labeled with the same business account, Silver Harbor Holdings. I held the phone out to her. "You thought it was Evan, didn't you?" Her fingers trembled as she took the phone, reading each line. Her eyes widened, tears forming at the corners. "You did all this?" "I did it because you're my family," I said quietly. "Even when you made me feel like I wasn't yours." She covered her mouth, sobbing quietly. My father put an arm around her shoulders but didn't speak. After a moment, she reached up to her neck, unclasped the sapphire necklace I hadn't seen since I was a child. The one Grandma Martha had given her before she died. The same one my mother had once given to Victoria. She stepped closer, her hands shaking. "I don't deserve to wear this," she whispered. "Your grandmother was right. Clean hands, strong walls." She fastened it around my neck. The sapphire felt cool against my skin, heavy with history. I didn't cry, though. Something inside me cracked open. I hugged her, awkwardly at first, then tighter as she began to cry harder. When she finally pulled back, her mascara had smudged her voice hoarse. "I was wrong about you. About everything." I smiled faintly. "That's okay. I was wrong about you, too. Maybe we can start over." She nodded, wiping her eyes. "I'd like that." My father exhaled long and slow. "You two done making me cry?" I laughed softly. For the first time in years, it didn't feel bitter. We sat for a while after that, not talking much, just existing in the same room without anger. The harbor outside glowed orange as the sun began to set, and the air felt lighter somehow, as if forgiveness had cracked a window open that had been sealed shut for decades. When they left, I stood at the window again, fingers brushing the sapphire pendant. The city lights flickered across the water, bright and distant. For years I'd thought success would fill the silence my family left behind, but maybe all I'd ever needed was this, a moment where we finally saw each other for who we really were. The world outside still buzzed with gossip and headlines, but in that quiet office above the harbor, I built my life around the noise finally stopped. 3 months later, the courtroom smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, the kind of scent that clings to long hours and longer truths. I sat in the witness chair under the fluorescent lights, the seal of the United States glinting above the judge's head. My palms rested flat on the polished rail, steady, deliberate. It was strange how calm I felt, like everything chaotic that had come before had already burned away, leaving only clarity. Rebecca stood beside me at the prosecution's table, her expression composed but sharp. Across the room sat the Hales, or rather what was left of them. Robert in a gray suit that couldn't hide the sweat beading on his forehead. Linda, pale and deflated fingers, twisting a tissue into knots. And Victoria. Sierra, staring down at the table, wrists cuffed, hair pulled back, her eyes dull. The prosecutor's voice cut through the air. "Miss Lane, please confirm for the court. You were the owner of Silver Harbor Hotel, the location of the incident." "I am," I said clearly. I own Silver Harbor Hospitality Group, 8 hotels along the East Coast, and you had no prior relationship with the defendants outside of your brother's engagement. None. He nodded, turning to the jury. And what prompted your actions that evening? I met his gaze. Then the jury's. A phone call I overheard. A lie too big to ignore. And a woman who thought she could use my family the same way she used everyone else. Rebecca gave a small, approving nod beside me. The prosecution laid out its evidence. Bank statements, false identities, testimony from defrauded investors. They played recordings, read emails. Sierra's voice, bright and confident, echoed through the courtroom promises of returns that never existed, projects that were nothing but air. Every word nailed the coffin shut a little tighter. When my testimony ended, the judge excused me. As I stepped down, flashes erupted through the glass doors at the back. The media had been waiting all morning. Outside the steps of the federal courthouse in Boston were a wall of microphones and questions. Reporters shouted over one another. "Ms. Lane, did you know the bride personally?" I paused long enough to face them, long enough to know what kind of dirt can hide under diamonds. The crowd erupted, cameras clicking, lights strobing across my face. Rebecca touched my arm. "Let's go before they start asking about your stock." We slid into the waiting car, but she wasn't wrong. By that evening, the story had twisted online. My competitor, Caleb Monroe, was stirring the pot, feeding the rumor mill. Anonymous posts and fake articles suggested I'd staged the entire arrest for publicity, to boost the Silver Harbor brand. It worked just enough to spook investors. Stock prices dipped 3% overnight. Marcus called the next morning. "You want me to crush this Monroe guy?" "No," I said. "I'll handle him myself." The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A week later, we were both invited to a charity gala for business leaders in Providence. He was hard to miss, tall, smug, a champagne glass always in hand. When he spotted me across the room, he smiled like a fox that had found a henhouse. "Harper Lane," he drawled. "Quite the headline act these days." I smiled back. "You think you can smear me into selling Caleb?" He tilted his glass. "Everyone has a price. Not for truth." I turned and walked away, leaving him mid-sip. Behind me, I heard someone laugh softly at his expression. That night, I decided to end the rumors my way. Clean and public. The following morning, I called Rebecca and Marcus into my office. "Press conference," I said. "Tomorrow." Marcus frowned. "Press. Are you sure that's smart?" "You hate cameras. I hate lies more." The next day, I stood before a sea of microphones in the hotel's glass atrium. The reporters looked restless, ready for a scandal. Instead, I gave them numbers. Audited financials verified by third-party firms showing every clean transaction, every employee paid fairly, every tax filed honestly. Then I announced the creation of the Silver Harbor Foundation, a scholarship for the children of hotel workers, covering tuition and housing at accredited colleges. "Hotels aren't built by CEOs," I said. "They're built by the people who scrub the floors, change the sheets, and carry the luggage. This company exists because of them." The room went quiet. Then the applause started, slow, then rising. By evening, the headlines had flipped. "CEO who cleaned floors cleans up the industry. From housekeeper to hotel mogul, Harper Lane's real legacy." The stock rebounded within 24 hours. Caleb Monroe released a half-hearted statement congratulating me on my commitment to transparency. I didn't bother responding. A week later, the jury delivered their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Wire fraud, conspiracy, identity theft, tax evasion. The Hales were sentenced to federal prison and ordered to pay restitution to their victims. Sierra's lawyer tried to argue diminished responsibility. The judge wasn't moved. When the verdict was read, Sierra looked up at me for the first time in months. Her eyes were hollow. For a second, I saw the same woman from the wedding night smiling like the world was hers. Then she lowered her head. I stayed until the gavel fell, the sound final, like a door locking on the past. Outside, the courthouse steps were packed again, the autumn air crisp and biting. Reporters shouted questions, flashes blinding in the gray light. As I moved through the crowd, someone called out, "Ms. Lane, how does it feel to win?" I paused, turning toward the noise, the cameras, the chaos. "It's not about winning," I said simply. "It's about finally being seen." For a moment, the crowd fell silent. Then the shouting started again, louder than before, but I was already walking down the marble steps, the sound of my heels swallowed by the wind. 1 year later, the ballroom at Silver Harbor shimmered in morning light. The chandeliers caught the sun like they were made of new beginnings, scattering gold across white linen tables. The scent of coffee and fresh pastries filled the air as servers moved gracefully through rows of investors, hotel executives, and scholarship recipients. It wasn't a wedding this time. It was something better. A celebration that didn't need champagne to feel honest. I stood near the stage dressed in a navy suit, my grandmother's sapphire necklace resting against my collarbone. The pendant had become part of me, not just a memory, but a reminder. Across the room, a banner hung above the stage, Martha Quinn Foundation Scholarship Breakfast. Building futures with clean hands. Nicole Peterson, 23, stood at the podium, clutching her note cards, like they might keep her upright. She had the same nervous smile I used to wear in interviews years ago. Her hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and her voice trembled slightly as she began. "My name is Nicole Peterson," she said, glancing around the room. "And I'm a hospitality management student at the University of Rhode Island. This scholarship, it's more than money. It's hope." She paused, looking at me before continuing. "Sometimes I feel like people look down on me for where I came from. Small town single mom, 2 jobs. Like I'm not supposed to be in rooms like this." The audience was quiet, listening. I smiled and stepped closer to the stage. "Let them," I said gently, my voice carrying through the room. "While they're looking down, you'll be rising up." Laughter and applause broke out, soft but real. Nicole smiled, her shoulders relaxing. She found her rhythm, finishing her speech with newfound confidence. When she stepped down, I shook her hand and said quietly, "Your story's just getting started. Make it count." She nodded, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Lane, for everything. Call me Harper," I said. "Titles are overrated." After the event, people mingled, sipping coffee, exchanging business cards. Investors talked about growth and expansion, but I wasn't listening. My attention was on the staff. Bellhops straightening tablecloths, housekeepers collecting empty plates, managers directing with quiet efficiency. They greeted me as I walked through the lobby. "Morning, Ms. Lane," one called out. "Good morning," I answered with a smile. Each greeting felt like a small victory. They weren't just employees. They were the backbone. The kind of people who made sure the floors stayed spotless even when the people walking over them didn't deserve it. I paused by a marble column near the entrance. The same one I'd touched the night before Evan's wedding. My fingers brushed the cool surface again. The same stone, the same polish, but everything else had changed. My reflection stared back at me, merged with the soft light from the chandelier above. I used to clean floors. Now I clean up messes people make with their lies. The dirt never disappears, but it always shows you who's who. I walked outside the doors, gliding open to the terrace, overlooking the Atlantic. The air was crisp, the kind of clean that wakes you up from the inside out. Waves rolled gently against the shoreline, each one erasing traces of the last. The horizon stretched wide and clear blue as the sapphire around my neck. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was fighting gravity. I'd built something solid, something that couldn't be taken from me. My family was healing. Evan had started volunteering with the foundation. My mother called every Sunday now, not out of obligation, but out of care. Sometimes we even laughed. The world still carried its share of liars, cheats, and con artists, but I didn't need revenge anymore. Not really. The truth had done its work, and it was enough. I stood at the railing, eyes closed, feeling the sunlight warm my face. The ocean breeze tugged gently at my hair. Sometimes justice looks like revenge, but real justice is peace. I opened my eyes, smiled, and turned back toward the hotel. The place that once broke me now, the place I rebuilt myself in. If you believe in stories where dignity wins, subscribe and share your own. I read every word.